Have you seen the new movie Oppenheimer about the father of the atomic bomb?
Do you feel anxiety about living in a nuclear age? And what is the role of art in helping with that anxiety?
How do we be both realistic about this atomic age we live in and also hopeful about our future?
I'm Dave Denny.
I'm Tessa Bilecki.
And this is Fire and Light.
Conversations about life, love, and soul. Hello, everyone. It's August.
A very hot August.
A very hot August all around the world. And here in Arizona, the monsoons have finally come. In fact, we have actually had a monsoon every night for the last 5 nights, which is a real blessing. And if you listen to our podcast last month about harvesting saguaro fruit, the rains have come, as the Tohono O'odham say. Well, when we harvest the saguaro fruit, we're pulling down the clouds, we're pulling down the rain, and we're seeing it.
Yes.
We're seeing it.
It worked.
Well, August is a special month for me personally because 56 years ago, on August 17th, 1967, I left the before of my life and I went to Sedona, Arizona, and first joined the Spiritual Life Institute. That's my after. And I began my contemplative life there. I fell in love with the physical desert, with the spirituality of the desert, and with the Carmelite tradition. The Spiritual Life Institute was Carmelite, and that's going to be significant in relation to Oppenheimer and the atomic bomb, and we'll get to that. If you don't know what the Carmelite tradition is all about, I would have been posting it anyway, but after seeing Oppenheimer, just had to talk about the Carmelite tradition in a post that I'm calling the Yin Yang of Carmel, which you can find on tessabilecki.com.
You also fell in love with a particular place in Sedona, didn't you, where you celebrated masses?
Yes, with Holy Cross Chapel, which was part of the Spiritual Life Institute when I first joined. We were the custodians of the chapel, and there was an extraordinary crucifix hanging there, which I wrote about in my post last month. If you haven't seen it, again, it relates to this amazing movie by Christopher Nolan, director of Oppenheimer. The crucifix came to be known as the Atomic Christ. It was created by a sculptor in the 1950s. And by 1973, that sculpture was taken down and destroyed. It was very controversial. It looked like it had been through radiation exposure. It looked like a bomb had been dropped on it. There's actually a powerful scene in Oppenheimer where Oppenheimer encounters a charred body after Hiroshima. This crucifix looked like that. It was very controversial. That's another before and after. We can talk about Holy Cross Chapel before, when the Christ of the Atomic Age hung there in all its blackened, ravaged horror, and after, when people could not acknowledge, when our friend Cornelia Sussman is the one who named it Christ of the Atomic Age. And she wrote something very powerful about it. She wrote a meditation and she asked these questions. Is this how you, capital Y, is this how you look after Hiroshima? Is this how you look after each atomic blast? And then the most challenging question of all, is this what we have done? And I think that's partly why the crucifix was taken down, is that it was a reminder of what we have done and the age that we now live in.
It seems like that's happening a lot in our country these days, of not wanting to deal with the certain parts of history that we are embarrassed by or even question.
Yeah.
But I think it's hard to question what happened in Japan.
So Dave and I just made a trip to Sedona. We had to sell our property there, our land and buildings there, in 1983 because of encroaching land development. The place is now a huge golf course and vacation homes. It was very painful to leave. That's part of the after for us, is the pain of that. And then shortly after we came back from Sedona, we went to see Oppenheimer. And how did you respond to that, Dave?
Well, it's not easy to give one reaction because it was about a 3-hour movie. And as many people have said, it's all talk, and yet the pace is breakneck. It's an amazingly captivating drama. And of course, we know what the end is ahead of time. And yet, nevertheless, when you have to live with these people who are making decisions about this horrible weapon that's being developed, there's strange combinations of excitement about the science of it, then the horror of it, the potential destruction, and all of that gets played out.
Next to literature, film is my favorite art form. And I treasure movies. And I treasure them because I get to experience parts of life on a profound and emotional level that I would not experience, period. So I'm never going to build an atomic bomb. I'm not going to drop a bomb on Japan.
Right.
But I got to feel what that was like because of this great movie. So we can't say enough to you about how important it is to go see it. And I think the questions that come out of that are precisely the questions that Cornelia Sussman wrote when she was meditating on the Christ of the atomic age. Is this how you look after Hiroshima? Is this how you look after each atomic bomb? Is this what we have done? And here's what's super uncanny for Dave and me: the name of the test.
Yes, the detonation, the original detonation, which occurred in New Mexico, the experiment was called the Trinity Project.
Yeah. That we as Christians think of God as a holy Trinity, and that they would name the testing of this bomb Trinity is pretty creepy. And the date, Dave, what was the date of that test?
That test was July 16, 1945.
And that is a huge Carmelite feast. That is the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. You can read about her in my post on tessabalecki.com. But the fact that the test was on the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel is also pretty creepy for me. And then the date of the actual dropping of the bomb?
August 6th, just a few weeks later.
And that feast?
That's the Feast of the Transfiguration. And for those of you who may not be familiar with that story, it was a moment in the life of Jesus when he goes up on a mountain. 3 of his disciples are with him, and they see him, the word is transfigured, and sort of glowing with this wondrous light. And they sense that he is the successor to the prophets, the successor to Moses. This is like a whole new chapter in their spiritual history. And at that time, then he says, yes, this is beautiful, and they're going to kill me. So it's a very dramatic moment of glory and light, and yet also ominous.
Yeah, because he's basically talking about the crucifixion.
Yes.
And that is certainly, if we were going to use Christian imagery, that is what the people of Japan experienced with the dropping of the first bomb on the Feast of the Transfiguration, second bomb 3 days later. Japan was crucified. I think it's important. And again, I see that crucifix from Holy Cross Chapel. So there was a magnificent piece of art manifesting our human response to this incredible human tragedy. And one of your favorite poets, Dave, Denise Levertov, wrote a poem about this experience.
Yeah, the late American poet Denise Levertov was a peace activist. And she wrote a poem on the 32nd anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Which would have been 1977, which is almost 50 years ago. The dropping of the bombs was almost 80 years ago.
So she's writing about how her fundamental reaction was relief that the war had ended. And she's like 20 years old. She's ready to go on with her life. Everybody's been tired of this war. She says, we didn't notice the quantum leap. We'd heard about numbers of people dead here and there in World War II, and it didn't soak into their young minds that this was a quantum leap. And it's interesting that she uses that word.
Yes.
Because we're talking about quantum mechanics. There was no way for them to realize the shocking scale of this. She says the rumor was distant traffic, something that was going on somewhere else in the world. But the rest of us, we were just so happy to have the war over. We didn't really give it all that much thought. And basically, she says, I can't even remember that day. Neither can any of my friends. It was just a day of joy and hope.
She says something very powerful about the stones of Hiroshima there. Read that passage, because I have a big thing about stones. In fact, I'm kind of drafting a future post about stones, the importance of stones and what stones remember. And that's what she's talking about.
Yeah. So after setting us up by saying, it was a lovely summer day and we were all excited about going to college and beginning our young lives, she says, but the shadow, the human shadow graph, sinking itself indelibly upon the stone of Hiroshima as a man, woman, or child was consumed to unearthly fire. That shadow already had been for 3 days imprinted upon our lives.
Yeah, that is a chilling image.
Yeah.
That human beings, human flesh is burned into the stones.
Yeah.
Of that ravaged town. I mean, these are things we really have to look at. We really have to face. We really have to take responsibility for. So what happened on August 6th, 1945? The world changed forever. Now we have another before and after. We have the world as it was before the bomb was dropped, and we have the world after the bomb was dropped.
Yeah. I also ran into a story of a priest who was a counselor to these young soldiers who were in Japan. And he said, the church didn't have much to say about this. The government didn't have much to say about this. And I didn't have much to say about this to those young men who were going off to drop these bombs. And he said, I just was taught that this was inevitable, that we had no choice. And the moral thing was to end the war by dropping this bomb. And of course, we had no idea what it really involved. And his after was that many years later, and actually in 1980, he did a wonderful interview in Sojourner's magazine. And he said, we were brainwashed. And he repented profoundly and became a peace activist and promoted the abolition of nuclear weapons. His name was George Zabelka.
And when you see Oppenheimer or you read the book American Prometheus, on which the film is based, although Christopher Nolan did an absolutely brilliant job of taking a 700-page book and writing a brilliant film script. But there's a before and after also for Robert Oppenheimer, father of the atomic bomb.
Yeah, he was very ambitious and he was excited about this possibility and pulled together some of the most brilliant physicists of the time, racing to try to come up with this weapon before the Nazis did. And so there was a kind of excitement about it and a thrill almost about it. And yet gradually, of course, as he came to realize the scale of the thing and the damage that had been done. God bless Harry Truman, our president. He was wonderful in many ways, but this is one way I just can't identify. He just basically said, I've had it with these crybaby scientists. We ended the war. That's what people wanted. I've never lost any sleep over the decision.
Yeah, I've never lost any sleep over it. But what the film shows is the tortured soul of Robert Oppenheimer as he faces the moral consequences of what he did. And I think the questions that the film raises are important questions that all of us have to come to terms with. It's a kind of amazing, all these convergences. I don't believe they were coincidences, but convergences that happen in a moment of time. So I start thinking about the Christ of the Atomic Age in Sedona and how that Christus was taken down and destroyed because we didn't want to face what we had done. We go to Sedona, the movie comes out, and the other thing, another convergence that happened around this time, is that the great Daniel Ellsberg died. In case there are younger people listening who don't know who Daniel Ellsberg was, talk a little bit about him and what his life's work was. You know, what's striking me about him is, in a sense, there was no before and after for him. He was consistent throughout his life. He was an anti-nuclear activist throughout his entire life.
He gave an interview just before he died for the New York Times. And I'll put links to all these articles and people I've mentioned on a post I'm going to do on sandandsky.org. Ellsberg told Lulu Garcia Navarro of the New York Times how at age 13, his social studies teacher asked the students this question: what if we created a bomb that was just so big that it would destroy all these people indiscriminately, would just scare the rest of the world to death, and maybe that would bring peace? Was that a good idea? And he and his 13-year-old friends, he said, you don't need to be a moral prodigy to answer that question. Of course it's a bad idea. And then a few months later, he said, I remember I'm in Detroit, a trolley car drives by, and then I look down at a headline and it says, we've bombed Hiroshima. And he said, oh my gosh, we discussed this in class as this vague possibility. And suddenly, within months, it was a reality. And that set his life on a certain course. He became famous, of course, for these Pentagon papers, which he illegally copied because he was working for a group called the Rand Corporation. They were doing research and development on the war in Vietnam. And he'd been there. He'd seen what was going on. He knew that all the leaders knew it was unwinnable. He knew that the war was immoral and no one was doing anything about it. So he leaked these papers to the New York Times and became very close to being thrown into prison for treason. The president of the United States committed some crimes with regard to Ellsberg, and therefore Ellsberg was never sent to jail, and lauded by many as a real hero because of what he revealed about the corruption and the real story of the Vietnam War.
And then the rest of his life was working against the arms race and the proliferation of weapons.
What most people didn't know was he had also stolen a bunch of stuff about nuclear warfare from the government. And unfortunately, that all got destroyed in a flood. So he never was able to release this stuff about nuclear warfare. But his basic pitch for the rest of his life was that this is extremely dangerous, that it's not like the president of the United States is the only person with his finger on the button. There are all kinds of other people at lower levels who could launch a war given certain circumstances. And he kept trying to, he thought that was more important than the Pentagon Papers, because the Pentagon Papers had to do with an immediate problem, whereas this is an ongoing problem for the ages. And so here we are today, still dealing with it.
And so then as a result of all of this, we have the Cold War. Again, younger people listening to this podcast, this may seem like ancient history to you. Well, I'm fascinated as I think about it. I think we all have to say, well, where was I when the bomb dropped? And Dave, you were a twinkle in your father's eye.
Yep.
Your parents were newly married and or courting. And I was born the year before the bomb was dropped. So I'm coming up on my first birthday, and the world is changing forever. And then the other big effect that this had on me personally is I'm growing up in the Cold War, where there's this kind of hysteria about anti-communism in the United States. So I majored in Russian in college precisely because of the Cold War, because I wanted to be able to do something about it. And if I can speak Russian, I can work for the United Nations, I can become a diplomat, who knows what. My life changed course, but my decisions about my college career were based on the Cold War. Now you've got some incredible stats. See, part of what Oppenheimer was aware that this was going to happen, that we were going to get into an arms race, a big competition with the Soviet Union, that this was going to cost a tremendous amount of money and create a lot of fear. So, like, I know you've always been interested in the immorality of how much money we spend on defense in this country.
We just this year set up the budget to spend over $800 billion on defense. Now, not all of that's nuclear, but still, that's a chunk of change. And just to put it in perspective, that is more than the 10 next highest budgets in the world. So there are 10 other countries out there who, if you added up all their, and they're the top, all of their defense budgets, that would be less than what we're spending. So there is a question of, how much is enough?
And because we put so much into the defense budget,
well, then we say things like, well, we can't have health care, or we can't pay a living wage. There's not enough money to go around. But I'm thinking, well, if, we're spending more than 10 countries combined, maybe we should rethink that.
Yeah. And again, you'll put all this information in your post on sandandsky.org, because I think it's important to look at the stats. Well, this could sound like a lot of doom and gloom. This could make people more frightened, more anxious. It raises the question of hope. And so here's Ellsberg. He's got all the info. He had inside info that the normal American citizen did not have. And yet, was he depressed? Was he?
Yeah. Then in this interview, Lulu Garcia Navarro says, "Well, gosh, are you cynical? Are you in despair here in your 93rd year and you're about to die?" And he said, "Oh, I'm very hopeful. I'm hopeful that my expectations are totally wrong."
Yeah.
It's kind of an unusual hope, as they often have been. So that's not an idle hope. No one would have predicted the fall of the Berlin Wall, Mandela becoming president of South Africa without a violent revolution. Impossible. And now, one thing that I saw as impossible was the Vietnam War ending in 1975. No chance. It's impossible, and it happened. So that, to me, is a miracle. And he goes on to say that most of us, we don't think a lot about your average Ukrainian. We don't think much about the Japanese people who died. But there are people, he said, who do care. They're my family. They're my tribe. And they may go to jail for what they believe in, engage in civil disobedience. But I love these people, and they give me hope. Rosa Parks was his hero. He actually got to meet her. He had a great sense of humor, too. So he said, this is a tremendous hope that these people bring to the world. He says, but I must tell you, it's a really bad career move to take this route.
Yeah.
So he ended on that note. I just thought that was so beautiful.
What do we mean by hope? One of my favorite descriptions of hope comes from our friend, the Benedictine monk, Brother David Steindl-Rast, who went through World War II in Austria. And talk about a man of hope, beautiful man of hope. And he describes it as radical openness for surprise, for the unimaginable, which relates to what Ellsberg is saying. I love how Ellsberg talks about all of these events that happened in time and space in our world. They were unimaginable and they happened. So we need to have hope. We can have hope because there's always room for the unimaginable. That's hope with a capital H, which is different from our hopes, small h, because our hopes are what we can imagine. And hope is for the unexpected, the surprise, the unimaginable. The interesting thing is, so we can ask, how is it possible that we can hold the realism of the atomic bomb, the atomic age, the dangers of nuclear arms, the peril in which we live? How can we hold that with hope? And it's a paradox. And there's a moment in Oppenheimer, I think it would be very easy to miss, but it's one of the most important moments for me that's sticking with me, where he's at the chalk blackboard, I think, doing these totally incomprehensible physics equations. And he's talking about the nature of reality. And, maybe you've heard, all matter is both wave and particle, energy and matter. He says, this is absolutely paradoxical. It shouldn't be, it can't be, but it is. His line is, it's paradoxical and yet it works. Well, this was one of those lightning bolt moments for me when he did this, because that's what hope is. Mystics are capable of holding at once two seeming contraries. And the rational mind says, no, this is not possible. Just like, on the one hand, Oppenheimer is saying, no, this is not possible. And yet it works. What that moment in the film did for me is I'm starting to think of hope as a law of physics. It's not just this mystical thing. It's not an aspiration. It's not airy-fairy. This is a law of physics. It can't be.
And it is.
And it is. And yet it works. So that's partly another expression of why we can have hope. I want to do another poem about hope before we come to our practice and our meditation for this podcast. I mentioned the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz. Miłosz had been through hell most of his life. So he's born and raised in Poland, poor. He goes through the whole Nazi invasion of Poland and the horrors that occurred for the Polish people during that period in their history. He lives through the communist takeover of Poland and again sees unimaginable horrors. And at the end of his life, he wrote a poem. Well, it's basically all about hope. He's looking back on his life and he's calling his life a life of bitterness and confusion. And he says, and in this bitter life, I learned about evil. I learned about my evil. I learned about other people's evil. And then and then how does he end up? I have been inspired by Czesław Miłosz for years because of this. He says, and yet all that I gathered from that life of confronting evil, of bitterness and confusion, is pure beauty and benediction, pure beauty and blessing. He said, wonder kept dazzling me, and I recall only wonder. And then he goes through a whole list I love how many poems are about lists. And he lists all the wonders, the sun rising, flowers opening, the shape of the mountains. And then he asks 3 questions. He says, is this the truth? The truth of the earth? How can laments and curses be turned into hymns? And then the third question is, why do I pretend when I know so much? What he's really saying is, I know about all this evil.
Mm-hmm.
I know about the bomb. I know about all these dangers and horrors. And yet, all I see is wonder. I think this is remarkable when we see a particular individual who has been through hell and can talk like this. This isn't theory. This is going through the fire and coming out as a person of hope and a person of peace. So, our practice, our challenge practice for all of you who are listening for this month is, first of all, go see Oppenheimer. Think about it, meditate on it, talk about it with your family and friends. And how does it affect you? How does it change you? How will you live your life differently as a result of having seen it and live in hope? As Daniel Ellsberg describes it, as Miłosz describes it, as Brother David Steindl-Rast describes it. And I love how Miłosz says, is this the truth of earth? So we come back to the earth. What is the truth of earth? Years ago, we found this very beautiful prayer from the Ute tradition. The Ute is an indigenous people in western Colorado and southeastern Utah, the land of the Utes. And they have a tremendous wisdom about the truth of the earth, which in the face of the atomic bomb, in the face of the atomic age that we live in, I think is a perfect meditation for this time. So set us up, Dave.
Take a deep breath. Take more than one. And as I said last time, you don't have to put aside all your anxieties. Sometimes the best way to meditate is to bring those anxieties to mind and place them in this atmosphere of benediction that Miłosz described, in a larger world of healing and a world of compassion. And then allow your mind and your heart to be receptive to the unimaginable that opens us in hope.
Earth, teach me stillness, as grasses are stilled with light.
Earth, teach me suffering, as the stones suffer with memory.
Earth, teach me humility, as blossoms are humble with beginning.
Earth, teach me caring, as the mother who nurses her young.
Earth, teach me courage, as the tree which stands all alone.
Earth, teach me freedom, as the eagle which soars in the sky.
Earth, teach me limitation, as the ant which crawls on the ground.
Earth, teach me resignation, as the leaves which die in the fall.
Earth, teach me to remember kindness, as dry fields weep with ruin.
Earth, teach me to forget as the melted snow forgets its life.
Earth, teach me regeneration as the seed which rises in the spring.
Earth, teach me regeneration as the seed which rises in the spring.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everyone. And please come back. Listen again next month. In a couple of weeks, we are going to be going to Chicago for the Parliament of the World's Religions. And our podcast in September is going to bring you with us and share with you our enthusiasm for the importance of dialogue between all the traditions around the world. How do we see our religious yearnings manifested? We'll see you in September.
In the meantime, you can visit us at www.sandandsky.org or
TessaBalecki.com. And if you like what you hear, push that donation button. And please tell your friends about this podcast. Share this podcast with your friends.
You've been listening to Fire and Light.
Conversations about life, love, and soul.
The background music for Fire and Light is The Day We Met, composed and performed by Ricky Zhao.
Fire and Light's theme music is Dreamcatcher, composed and performed by Chris Martin and Jeff Harvey at Purple Planet Music.
Fire and Light is recorded in Tucson, Arizona, editing by David Levin.